I've been thinking about after this invitation. So I appreciate this opportunity to share that. So any comments, any questions, any thoughts, what, your experiences, I would love to hear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker, for that wonderful information sharing you gave. And that has really, I just listening to you, I learned a lot. Sometimes we know what we know, and you listen to other people, you tend to really increase your own knowledge of what one thing that they know, or that even they know better sometimes. You find out when you listen to other people that there's a lot to learn. So the Valentine's Day, you have talked to us and also blended that with the Black History Month we're celebrating. I never knew that there was a time it was just a Black History Week. So
Yes.
and that's really interesting.
Yeah.
The question
And the celebration.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say the celebration actually began, I think it was 1926, by Carter Woodson and a gentleman by the name of Moreland. I think it was Moreland. He was a minister, Protestant minister. And they had an organization, I think it was the National Association for the Study of Negro Life. I think today it's African American life and history and life, or life and history. So that's what, from back in 1926, and the whole purpose was to look at the contributions of African Americans in this country. And if we look at 1926, that was during the time when, Jim Crow, there were lynchings throughout the country, throughout the South, certainly segregation, but the North in the South, but the North was just as bad. And so that's really how this celebration came about. And it wasn't until the 70s that our country even acknowledged it officially through the executive branch. I think it was Gerald Ford who officially acknowledged the celebration of African American history. I think by then it was already becoming a month.
Thank you for that information. So I was just wondering, so was it because there was an association that you mentioned, National Association of Living Life, that made them to expand it to 1 month? Is that correct?
Yes. I at some point in life, I said, when did it become a month? I don't think it was just overnight. In some places it was still a week, and then, eventually people started talking more about a month. But there were places within the United States, schools, towns, churches, municipalities, that didn't acknowledge it at all. I think with television and media in general, there's a lot more exposure for people, thinking about this, commercials. What we see happening today on television just around this month, we did not see 30, 40, 50 years ago.
So what with that? See that as because of internet, that people are beginning to be more aware that this spreading, this innovation, this technology has helped people to kind of share it with the rest of the world. I want to put it that way. That that it's like a lot of people are beginning to embrace it. And started maybe to feel like talking about it. Why I'm asking you this question is sometimes this is only my experience. I've been in the United States for 20 years and didn't really know a whole lot while I was outside the United States about what I learned, when I came in here about the history of African Americans. But one thing that I noticed, even professionally, whenever people start asking questions, like I do, because I never really have to be honest. I'm really ignorant of a whole lot of African American history. It's only when I came here that I started, learning. So, but the first thing I noticed was how sensitive people feel about, even talking about it. So I don't know whether there's that feeling of guilt or feeling of fear or I don't know what it is. I want us to know that
Well,
I invited you today to talk about this. It's not just to give fears or anxiety or unease, to anybody. But for me, we are right now, 2021. It's a different year, it's a different century. And we often learn from what has happened in the past. So that's why I invited Dr. Tucker to talk to us about her experience of, what she knows about the Black History Month. Go ahead, Dr. Tucker, sorry.
I was wondering your other participants, their thoughts as well. I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but right now in our country, I think there is a reaction, and it's been going on for some time. And right now, I just maybe with each year as I get older, I'm feeling it more. And I think there is a reaction, not just to Black History Month. That's really not the issue, a month, but to the role and history and participation of African Americans in this country. And I think there are some of our white brothers and sisters in this country are what would be the way that there is a perception that this is not important, that African Americans and other people of color are becoming too dominant, statistically, demographically. And I think there is a backlash. We've had it all along, but some of the Band-Aids that people would have put over their mouths before, social media has allowed them to remove it. And so what we hear and what we read, and I personally, I think that's part of what we are experiencing and hearing as to what's happening in Florida around the AP courses, the backlash that we've heard all over the country and about wokeness and the burning, books, not literally burning them, but books in libraries and what can be taught and what history and role of African Americans in the country, what we can teach and can't teach, that this is not important. And so what does it mean to be an American in this country today? And that's where I think we are facing some really crucial issues that will have to be addressed. They're not going to be. It's not going to be done overnight. And I think you have to have dialogue. And that's one thing I've learned in working with the other communities I mentioned, the Hispanics and Koreans and Vietnamese and Africans, that we have to have dialogue. And that because you lift up one doesn't mean others aren't important. So that's a concern, and that to me is not a symbol of love or how we respect one another. I think there is a lack of, and I think it has to do with a lot of fears as well. So I don't know the answers, but I would be just curious to see. I'm speaking from an African American perspective. I would love to hear what some of the others have to say from their own racial, cultural perspective, and also not being a Pittsburgher.
Yes, thank you so much. So, Joe, I'm gonna let Emily and Claude give us some perspective from listening to the talker. What you guys have to say about this issue? Because I mean, this is no longer something that is hidden. It's something we talk about. It's something we celebrate. It's also something we want to actually have a conversation with or about, and in a mutual, mature, respectful manner. So I want to invite both of you to give us your own perspective.
So Emily, where do you want to get started? You're muted. All right, here you go. Our podcast engineer coming in. Emily, are you there? You should be on the telephone.
You can go.
Oh, I can go. All right. All right, Emily. So here we go, Emily. I'm going to give you some fuel for the fire so you can go ahead and get us stoked up after I'm done. But the idea of, the dialogue, I agree with, because as much as I've heard in the last decades of my life, I'm 51 years old. And so I think really in this conversation, the more significant history for me is, in the last 20 years. Basically in 1990, I graduated high school from a very, I'll say white dominated community in the 80s in Milwaukee. I believe it was called like Chapter 220 or something. So there was an integration program that I at least experienced in the 80s where we were having busing from the city of Milwaukee out to the suburbs where I'm at. And so it was an interesting timing for me in what this conversation is. And then I went off to UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison, where that really for me, as a teenager coming out of my teen years into being a college student and being at University of Wisconsin-Madison, more experiencing diversity. And also in 1990 was the Americans with Disabilities Act. So when you talk about civil rights, I kind of remember how well the Americans with Disabilities component was brought out. And in the last 10 years, disability advocates taught me about intersectionality. So when you talk about, Black Americans with disabilities, and if you're talking, a lesbian Black woman with a disability, and you just really start layering it. It's really interesting how this speaks to our country's history and culture and what we're dealing with at the time. So for me, with Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream, and the messages that he poured from his heart, making available to us, and for gleaning that where, he spoke about children of all, races, creeds, and colors, playing together. I've said it in a completely separate context, about the idea of people and babies, like being here with Zetas Healthy Beginnings. I've said many times in my life that really, to me, babies are born perfectly. And then from there, society messes it all up. And so
They go
on
to
this
school.
issue, it's very interesting where children pick up bias because until they
Mhm.
learn it from the adult community, it's not there. So then the
Right.
dialogue to me is, where are kids picking up this bias? And what do we need to do on an intergenerational basis to,
Mhm.
to heal from the fear? Because I think that's where it
Right.
comes from. Because economically in the States, with the lower middle and upper class, some political speakers talk about how this class separation is like the middle class is all about, like, they don't want to become the lower class. So there's like a little bit of a fear factor that they're scared into compliance or something, because they don't want to be in that class. So when you talk about a disproportionate, disadvantaged, systemic oppression, and all these things that I've had to learn about in the last couple decades, more so in the last 10 years for me, because I've been a part of some racial equity conversations, and
Mhm.
and it really brings to me the fear factor. So to me, the narrative to me is more of this boldness. The more we can make it bold, 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 that now is the
Mhm.
time, and we are the ones, and each individual can really steer the future in the right direction. Like, Zita and I met through the Happy Neighborhood Project, and Edwin Edeberry and his wife, Helen Kayoma, they remind us all the time, don't let the past or the future rob us of the present. So if we can all make that a concerted effort in the ideas of like carpe diem and so forth, seize the day, everything that we do every day can make a big difference. And if we have hundreds of millions of people across the land really hearing that message, I just feel we can take a great quantum leap in the right direction. I think that's what needs to be done. When I was in college, you're out there to study. And what was amazing in peer pressure does apply in college. And the idea is, we had a friend who always coaxed us into doing stuff we really shouldn't have been doing, because we should have been studying. The way he did, he's like, everybody's doing it. So you didn't want to be left out, the fear of missing out. That's even a business thing, when you learn business. So I think doing more of what we see, like today with the Happy Neighborhood Project, the Black Entrepreneurs Group, the feedback I got today about the Black Entrepreneurs Group with the Happy Neighborhood Project, by the way, the happiest place in the world for business people, is that there was a great resonance and energy and vibration. The participants today give me the idea that I missed out because I wasn't there. And I think if we can do more of that kind of stuff, we're on to a neat pathway. And I think there's been enough history here where we just gotta encourage people to get in and do something and make a difference today. And so, Emily, how are you going to make a difference today? I'm curious what your remarks say.
Well, I'm helping with this podcast.
Funny?
I think if you're talking about just about today, I think the biggest thing is for this podcast right now.
I'm just wondering.
That is a good point. That when we have diverse teams working on this issue, that's really neat, because it's not just the Black community producing a nice wow podcast about Black History Month and so forth.
Right.
We have the diversity here that says we're all on board to this concept. It's not just for Black Americans. It's actually more especially for those that aren't in the Black community, like Emily.
And that was, and that's been part of the issue with Black history. It's not for African American people merely. it's history of our country. So when you're
Right.
studying one thing and remembering it and reading it and celebrating, you're celebrating the entire country. I look at, 30 years ago, how many of us were celebrating Cinco de Mayo? Now it's becoming mainstream, celebrating in January Chinese or Asian New Year. So I think there is this intersectionality between our cultures and what we can do. I also think that fear can mobilize and immobilize people. As well as what can we do, but I'm afraid to step forward. And how do we get people to let those guards down? Because the fear keeps us from recognizing and appreciating. And in my experiences, sometimes people are just so afraid of stepping out. And
Yeah,
how
let
do we
me-
help them? I think it's taking them, sometimes it's literally taking them by the hand.
Yeah, let me share an interesting happening close to me, close to my home here. And working on disability advocacy and with disability agency here in Wisconsin. And, I'm just west of Milwaukee, in the county next to Milwaukee County. It's called Waukesha County. And what was interesting to realize is somebody that, I respect greatly for his work here in Wisconsin, helping, legislatively and in bureaucracy and, in the work that agencies are doing, to make shifts in the right direction. And he's a very successful business person. So he brought business acumen to create community solutions. And one of those proposally was right close to me here in a city just south of me here in the county, again, just west of Milwaukee. And he was putting this multifamily housing unit together, and something that, is going to be very affordable housing. And, he was in disability advocacy, so is going to go ahead and help be in universal design, and kind of really be a great place for people with disabilities to be in as well. So a great social solution. But what happens to this man? He receives threats. Now, this is just 8 years ago, so 2023, and you're talking, right around the cusp of celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. He's getting a threat about this whole thing, like don't be bringing
A
this
threat
into
for
our
participating.
Yeah, and the idea is that what he found out with dealing with this threat, he found out it was rooted with the KKK. So that's really
Yeah, they are
really
alive.
alarming to me that is such a right thing just 8 years ago, that the KKK is steering things yet, at this day and age, and it's such a great thing. And to put that element of fear out there so that this great man, chose not to do the project. Just absolutely.
Oh, he chose not to participate.
Yeah, because of the KKK.
Yeah, it was because of the KKK that the whole thing got squashed, because the local authorities and the people who were doing this just saw that it was going to be bringing in an element of chaos that they did not want to be dealing with. So as much as this man would have done it, the people around him who he counted on to give the permits and to do all the work, nobody was participating with the project because of these threats.
And so that's an example of fear.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we think that the KKK and such organizations went away. But just until recently, Florida had more hate crimes, followed by Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and I know here in Milwaukee, the city and the region of Milwaukee also, has a lot of racial divide and actually, to the detriment of, unfortunately, our Black community here in Milwaukee. Just Milwaukee's got a lot of healing to do, so we're right in there with that issue of divide and hate.
And I think
I don't know how much it's hate crime exactly, if we're leading in that way, but one way or another, the presence of divisiveness over the racial element is very very much in the extreme, where nationally Milwaukee is not in a good place in that topic.
And from my experiences working with various groups throughout the country, exactly what you said is what we hear in Pittsburgh, what we hear throughout. In terms of housing, sometimes it's not the top of the list are anti-Black or anti-Hispanic, but is anti-person with disability and anti-LGBT community. So it's, I think there are similarities, and I think we are being driven by fears and those who are afraid of, I just call it the browning of America. I think people are afraid of losing power, whatever they perceive this power to be. And so that's why I believe the reactions that I hear and see on the news, and particularly in these last 4 to 6 years, the hatefulness, those to me are signs of deep division that didn't just start overnight. So the question is, how do we then work together and to those of like minds, but how do we challenge those kinds of comments, the rhetoric, the actions that we hear from politicians, we hear in communities, and unfortunately, we hear and see in faith communities. Because I think that fear is widespread, equal opportunity fear of the other, whatever we perceive that other as.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up about faith community, because the last 20 years, or I guess about 20 years ago, it kind of came to be where it was like all about the most segregated day in America is Sunday because of faith communities, right? So I'm glad you brought that up. But other than that, Zita, I don't know if we need to wrap up, or are we going to do an encore?
I got excited all of a sudden. And you say Sunday is the most segregated day in the week. What exactly?
That means that if you pay attention where people are on Sunday morning, and you look at how it's still very racially polarized, how people are in congregations. Now, obviously, that's a stereotype, but yeah, if you look at the macroscopic level, and you look at on Sunday morning across the country, you have people congregating to their faith community based on race, by and large. But there's a lot of faith communities that are excellent in diversity, but that's more of the few and far between, unfortunately.
And Zita, that quote came, was it Martin Luther King? I think who said it. Anyway, it comes from the 50s, 60s during the civil rights era. Just an example of how segregated we are, and in terms of our churches. But if we look at the history of the United States, that has been our history. And within the Catholic Church, it was just as segregated as all of the other Christian. However, earlier on, from the Revolutionary period to the Civil War, the other Protestant communities would even allow slaves to conduct services, although there was segregation within those religious denominations. But it is, unfortunately, I think, still, the quote still stands. Now, Zita was probably wondering, because in our particular church, it is an African American personal parish for African Americans, but we have a number for decades of white parishioners, Africans, Hispanics, and others. So it is an example of diversity, but that is not the norm here in Pittsburgh. It is the exception. And we probably only have one or two places where it would be the exception.
This is really an interesting conversation. Dr. Tucker, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. And Todd, I really appreciate you also sharing your perspective. And like you rightly said, I think if we are celebrating anything in this country, it got to be for the country. It's not just for Cinco de Mayo or just for Black Easter month or whatever. And it gives us an opportunity. That's my own personal opinion. It gives us an opportunity to really rethink, come together, do that whole reunion, ask ourselves what we have done so far from whenever this happened to now. Where are we? Where do we plan to go? Because it's only, for me, it is only the best way to really be human, to live in peace, and joy, and connecting with one another, because none of us can really live alone. Nobody, that's not the way God has made us. I know human nature has that tendency to actually destroy what sustains it. That's a tendency we have in us, which we should also be aware of and call it out wherever we see it, because if it's not talked about, it's not really, nothing is done about it. That's why when I thought about this month, and I'm like, okay, we're not even just going to talk about this, just for one day, one Tuesday. Let me see how we can really get people who are interested in talking about this and get on with it. And not only just February, like Dr. Tucker said, whatever we started talking about this month, let's see if we can make some, let's see if we can make some success and pushing it forward into other months, especially till the end of December. Whoever that is interested in doing this, I will really, really appreciate us integrating that and see what we can do. And like Martin Luther King Jr. did, someone has to really take this by the head, because it's not looking for a change. We don't have to look so far to see who is going to do it. We are the people we are waiting. So I am glad that we have the courage to share our perspectives and together. Let's see what we can do with our fears, with our love, with our joy, with our uncertainty, and see if we can really engage each other in a healthy conversation and see where we go from here. Because for me, that's all we need. We need one another, whether we are aware of it or not. It is very essential, because nobody can do that by themselves. So, thank you again, Dr. Tucker, for coming. We're going to have to also invite you again in the future and take it from there. So
Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. Yeah, but to talk about any final, words for us, especially for women. This is a Word of Women podcast. What do you want to leave to women as a word of encouragement?
I'm sorry, were you asking a question?
Yeah, I said, what would be the last word you want to leave for our women? This is a Word of Women podcast.
Oh, well, men were present, so I enjoyed hearing the comments of both men and women.
Is that it? Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. What did you say? Sorry, I think I missed it.
I wasn't sure of your question. That's all. Your comment.
Okay. Okay. So what I was saying was, do you have any last words for? I said this is a podcast. We really, I know we have men in our midst, but it's a World of Women podcast. What words do you have to, for women listening this podcast, or who will listen in the future about all we have talked about?
Well, I do think women have the power to make a difference. We are making a difference. And I think we have the power to change and our country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I agree with you. And with that, I will say good night to all of us. And to remember, the Word of Women podcast is every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And until then, I'll say stay safe, stay warm, have a great night. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.